Good evening, gentlemen. We are in the middle, almost finished, although you'll find that the almost can be substantial. The almost can pack a punch. We're almost finished with chapter 4 of part 2 of the Tanya. We are in the middle of explaining, we're answering a vital question. The vital question is, if the existence of everything in the world is the fact, if everything in the world really just is the divine power which creates it, and it has no separation from that power, and everything that we know and everything that we experience is totally united with that divine power, why do we not perceive the divine nature of everything that is around us? We do not perceive the fact. We do not perceive God creating everything, something from nothing at every moment. All of that is hidden from us, and the world appears as it appears to be full of things that are independent of God and exist independently of His creation. The answer to this question, according to chapter 4 that we've been discussing the past 2 weeks, involves an understanding of Havaya and Elokim. Havaya is the expression of God. It's like the sun. Elokim is like the withholding or the shield or the nartik or the sheath that prevents that expression, that limits and restrains that expression. This is God's chesed and gvura, His kindness and His might. And His kindness and His might work together to create the world. The reason why we do not perceive godliness, we do not perceive Shem Havaya, which is His constant kindness, His constant creation of everything, something from nothing, is because He Himself conceals Himself from us using Shem Elokim. He withholds, He restrains His expression. And we spent a long time last week explaining the nature of Shem Elokim. Chaim. That Shem Elokim, that God's gevura, His severity, His strength, this withholding of His expression, this godly restraint is as impossible to understand in itself as the godly kindness, the act of creating something from nothing. And we explained why. Because both of them are really beyond human intellect. Both of them are united with God. Both of them involve a contradiction that is impossible to understand. They are both paradoxical. The act of creation is paradoxical because the nothing becomes something without becoming something. Right? The nothingness that exists before the world is created is made into something. But what is the nature of this something? The nature of this something is to be nothing. There is nothing really here at all. There is only God. So God in His Havaya, when He is acting as the creator of something from nothing, He creates, but what has He created? Nothing other than Himself. It's a paradox. There is something that is here, but the thing that is here is nothing other than God. There is nothing here. So there is a something which is nothing. A different way of putting it that I may have mentioned last week is that Shem Havaya adds without adding, right? It makes something new, it adds, like I'm saying mathematically, right? There's addition without addition. There's something new here. The table is here where there was nothing before, but what has been added? Nothing. There is no table here before. All that really is here is the same God who existed before the creation of anything. So something is added and yet nothing is added. Paradox. Impossible to understand, as we explained last week, just like the makom ha'aron eina min hamidah, that the place of the aron is without measure. And we explained how this is a contradiction because it's a miracle that happens because it's natural, and it's natural because it's a miracle. And it's basically an illogical cycle, impossible to explain, impossible to accurately grasp intellectually and to describe. Then we said Shem Elokim is really the same. Just as Shem Havaya adds without adding, we said Shem Elokim subtracts without subtracting. Right? Because just as within the human experience there is no creating something from nothing, and we have no conception of this idea of creating ex nihilo, of creating yesh ma'ayin, so too we have no conception whatsoever of God's restraint, of the way that God is preventing the expression of that light. He's preventing the expression of that creation. Why? Because in the world, if you want to take something away, if you want to prevent it from being expressed, you literally remove it, right? If I don't want there to be the perception of a table in this room, I take the table away. And then there is no perception of a table in this room. Shem Elokim is very different. When we say that it withholds the light, how much of the light does it withhold? None. How much of God's presence does it withhold? It does not withhold God's presence at all, right? In other words, if Elokim, if what we call tzimtzum, the contraction of the light, as we called it last week, if the contraction of God's expression, of His creation, something from nothing, truly withheld and restrained this creation, then there shouldn't be a table here, because there is nothing being created, right? It totally withholds this act of creating, or creating a physical universe. But what does Shem Elokim do? It does not withhold the actual act of creation. Creation takes place exactly as it would otherwise. What does Shem Elokim do? It changes the perception of that creation. It changes the way that creation is understood. No longer is the creation only something which is totally nullified within God. It is actually something with its own independent self-perception. Or as I put it last week, Shem Elokim makes that the process should actually yield a result. There should be a result of the process of creation. There is actually something created here. Yes? And this should be impossible, because if there is something created, that means Shem Havaya is here, fully present, because it is created. And yet, if Elokim is holding back Shem Havaya, there should be nothing created. So it's a paradox. Shem Elokim affects Shem Havaya in such a way that the thing is created, the thing is fully expressed, but how is it expressed? Contrary to its true nature. The true nature of the table is that God is constantly creating it. It is the process of its creation. Shem Elokim makes that this process should be perceived to yield a result, that there is actually a table separate from God that is created. So Havaya is here and not here under Shem Elokim. Elokim affects that this thing which is here and right before our eyes should not be perceived as what it really is. It changes it somehow. It withholds it, and yet it does not withhold it. It subtracts without subtracting. Shem Havaya is here, but Elokim takes it away. Yes, just as Elokim makes there be something even though nothing is here, Shem Elokim makes there be nothing even though something is here, if that makes any sense, right? Contradiction. Just as impossible to understand in its essence, in its foundations, as the creation something from nothing.
It's two contradicting contradictions.
Yes, they're both contradictions within themselves. Elokim by itself is a contradiction. Havaya by itself is a contradiction. And then they interact with each other and they fight over how to create the table, so to speak. They fight, right? There are two forces that go into it, so to speak. And so this, again, is the answer to the question from chapter 3. The question from chapter 3 is more or less answered. There will be more details and more things we go into as we progress through the Tanya, but the question is fundamentally answered. Why don't we perceive Shem Havaya within the table? Why do we not perceive God creating it constantly? Because Shem Elokim prevents it. Shem Elokim prevents it. Now this, Ronnie mentioned this last week, and I said we'd learn it next week, and I'm true to my word. This is different than what we said in chapter 3, that the reason why we don't see the godliness in the table is because of Einei Basar, is because of our fleshly eyes. Einei Basar, eyes of flesh, physical eyes, right? The whole question at the end of chapter 3 was that physical eyes can't really do what we're describing, right? What I just described to you, the whole paradox of Elokim, that Havaya, that God's creation of the table should be present, and yet be totally non-perceived at all. No physical eye can make that paradoxical division. In other words, what kind of eye would you have to have that sees the result, the so to speak non-existent result of Shem Havaya, but doesn't see the process of Shem Havaya? What eye can separate between the Shem Havaya which is in the table and the perceived independent table of Shem Elokim? Right? And the answer is, obviously there's no such thing. Either you see the thing or you don't see the thing. The eye can't make this, it's like seeing a cricket and seeing an elephant instead. Like, doesn't make any sense, right? There's no, that's not an eye problem. Maybe it's a brain problem, right? So we said that really the eye can't explain it, which is why we need Shem Elokim. But I would just like to note that there is a talk of the Rebbe where he explains that there is still an idea of ene basar, of the physical eye not being able to see godliness. Because even with Shem Elokim, right, that God is actively concealing himself from us. The reason I can't see godliness in the table has nothing to do with my eye. It has to do with the way God is creating the table. There's a Shem Elokim involved, which conceals the godliness of the process, right? So it has nothing to do with my eye. However, there is still an aspect sort of like an eye, which is something over which I have control. And this is what the Rebbe says in a Sikha, that even though Shem Elokim conceals the godliness within the table, we should not be limited as rational thinking human beings to understanding the table as an independent reality of Hashem. In other words, if Shem Havaya is the truth of the table, which as we discussed at length in chapter 2 and chapter 3, it must be the truth of the table, right? All logic demands that it be the truth of the table. So then why is it that when we think deeply about the table, without training, without Chassidus, I'm not saying after learning Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, I'm saying without training, when the average person on the street thinks deeply about what the table actually is, he should arrive at the conclusion that the table is nothing but the Word of God, which is constantly speaking it into existence, right? The Rebbe says the reason why the average person on the street does not come to this conclusion is because of Ene Basar, is because we are created, even though the mind can comprehend this, we are created as fleshly beings. The fact that we are embodied and the fact that the body is affecting us really affects our intellectual abilities. Our intellectual abilities, our ability to actually think in this way, is very much impacted by the body.
But once you know that this is the reality,
then
how do you sit at the table?
Then you are supposed to work, as the Rebbe Maharash said. I mentioned a few weeks ago. As the Rebbe Maharash said, you are supposed to refine the body, refine the animal soul, and then if you work to see it and you work to really understand it, you are able to have a certain grasp of the ayin, a certain perception of the nothingness of the table. So in other words, this ene basar that the body gets in the way is something that we can work on and can and should and are obligated to try and remove. By Hashgacha Pratis, I was actually learning something else in no particular connection to this today, and it was actually talking about the difference between the various souls that a Jew has, because the Alter Rebbe says there are two souls, but really the later Maimarim explain that it's three souls, and they explain how the three souls are implied in the Alter Rebbe's Tanya as not a contradiction. They're really grouped together in the Alter Rebbe as a whole thing. But long story short, the difference between all the souls is the way that they think. Really, this idea that I'm saying now
is the third, the Kiyumi?
The Nefesh HaSichlis is called in Chabad. Nefesh HaSichlis, the intellectual soul, which in Tanya is grouped together with the animal soul because both of them derive from Klippas Nega. They both derive from Klippa, and so they are grouped together. So it all has to do with how they think. The animal soul is mostly a being. This is totally a non sequitur. I'm just throwing it in because I happen to be learning it today. The animal soul is a totally is the aspect of the person. Really, is the person, right? Who is totally totally emotional, 100% midas, as we'd say, midot. Right? Its whole life is emotional. It has the ability to understand, but everything that it understands, the intellect is totally in service of the emotions. And the godly soul is the opposite. The godly soul is fundamentally the intellectual soul, despite the third soul being called Nefesh HaSichlis, which means intellectual soul. It's all explained in the Maimer. The Nefesh HaLekis is so intellectual that it's actually beyond being called the intellectual soul. It's a whole thing. But anyway, really the godly soul is fundamentally intellectual in that even though it has emotions, the emotions are all in service of its intellect. And the Nefesh HaSichlis is kind of this intermediary force, which has a cold.
Between the two other souls.
Yeah, it has a cold, sort of dispassionate intellect, which is not the godly intellect of the divine soul, but it's also not the totally corrupted, so to speak, and bribed emotional intellect of the animal soul. It's kind of this in-between thing, which is meant to connect the two souls. But anyway, that's what I happened to be learning today in connection with other things. So we have this ene basar, the body and the animal soul, prevent the average person, prevent the person who has no help from Torah or anything like that, from perceiving that the truth of the table is its ayin. The truth of the table is its nothingness, its bittul, its nullification within the Word of God, is the ultimate truth of the table. And the fact that we can't see this could be called enei basar, fleshly eyes. So we still have an idea of fleshly eyes even after this explanation. Shem Elokim really conceals godliness to us profoundly, but why do we not even reach intellectually the conclusion that Shem Havaya is creating it? Because we are limited by the body and the animal soul. And this brings us to the last few lines of the chapter. The last few lines of the chapter are going to take us as long as the rest of the chapter put together. Because these last few lines, the Rebbe makes there's a whole universe in the last few lines. It's in the English, it's like this, it's a page and a half. In the Hebrew, it's much shorter. And it starts from the brackets. We have brackets with vehine. Let me put in a word, first of all, about the bracket. This is a famous bracket, right? Like I said at the end of the last chapter, chapter 3 of Tanya ends with a famous question that has no answer. It's very unusual for a chapter in a Hasidic discourse to end with a question, and we spoke about that there, how this was a good question to sleep on and go home with and ponder, because the whole question was, how can the world appear to exist aside from God, which is a good question to have. Here, at the end of chapter 4, we have a famous bracket. The bracket is before Vehine. There is no end bracket, is the mystery. The mystery of this bracket... No, it is a mistake. It is a mistake. The question is, what's the nature of the mistake? There is no end bracket, right? You could joke that all of Chassidus, as it came out for the next 200 years, was all within the brackets, right? There's no end bracket anywhere. It started in the Tanya and it never ended, right?
If it would be written by Moshe, maybe, but here, the editor.
There's clearly a printing error. Now, the tradition... like the simple place to put the end bracket is at the end of the chapter, and there was a certain tradition that that's where the bracket is meant to go. No one knows for sure. There's a tradition that's where the bracket is meant to go. I don't think they have the Alter Rebbe's handwriting or anything like that for this. No one really knows where the end bracket is meant to go. But the Rebbe actually had a talk where he argued that the end bracket should go at the end of the next chapter. That the entire chapter 5 is within the brackets, because as the Rebbe points out, first of all, it makes sense in terms of the content of the chapters, because really the return to our main topic of Shem Havaya and Shem Elokim, and explaining Shem Elokim and all of these things, and sort of the flow, the very organized flow of the Tanya, really only continues in chapter 6. Chapter 5 really is parenthetical in what it's saying. It's a parenthetical sort of an addendum to the Tanya here. And not just that, but the Rebbe says, if you look at chapter 5, very suspicious. At the end of chapter 5, the chapter at the end has a source. And the sources in Tanya, the Mare Makomot, which say where a verse is from, for example, the sources are in brackets. So at the end of chapter 5, the end of chapter 5 ends on a bracket. So the Rebbe theorizes as follows, that in the original print of the Tanya, there were two closed brackets at the end of chapter 5. And some diligent printer at the printing house saw two brackets and naturally thought, that's got to be a mistake, because he couldn't find the opening bracket in chapter 5, and therefore he dropped one of the, like you can do in Word when you type two words in the same row by accident, right? You delete the second word, the repeated bracket. So that's the Rebbe's theory on the missing bracket. But the bracket belongs at the end of chapter 5. You could also put the bracket at the end of chapter 4. So I'm just giving you the full heads up, so you don't say that you learned Tanya chapter 4. Nobody talked about the famous bracket. Okay? So we have an opening bracket with no closing bracket. And then, now that I've explained the bracket, we get to the words inside of the bracket. And this is the hard part. Believe it or not, the explanation of Havaya and Elokim that I just summarized at the beginning of tonight's class is the simple explanation. That is the simple explanation. We are going to put a wrench in the works and explain it differently. And this different way is really the deeper way. You need all of the information to have a full picture. But the second way we're going to explain it is the deeper way, and will really be a stepping stone as we move through these chapters to higher and deeper understandings of what it is we're talking about. Okay? So it's a little abstract. I guess until now it was not exactly non-abstract, but it's going to be getting a little more abstract. I wish I had brought my prop. I wanted to bring a prop from home, but I forgot. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The prop may have helped. Maybe next time. We'll probably still be talking about the same thing next week. I'll bring a prop. Anyway, says the Alter Rebbe, V'hine, behold. Bechinas, we're on 867 in the middle. V'hine. Bechinas ha-tzimtzum, the tzimtzum, the hester ha-chayus, and the concealment of the divine life force that we have been discussing, nikra b'shem kelim, is called by the name kelim. Kelim means vessels. Vessels, like simply like you have kitchen kelim, right? Vessels, plates, cups, right? Stuff, pots, vessels.
Usually the tzimtzum is not related to Or and Sof.
Say again?
The tzimtzum is usually related to the Or, not to the vessels.
1 second. Many seconds actually, but we'll get back to that. V'chayas atzmai nikra b'shem Or. The life itself is called Or, is called light. The Alter Rebbe is telling us something that is quietly revolutionary. Alter Rebbe is telling us as follows, that these two things that we have been discussing, that the Shem Havaya, which is the God's act of constantly creating the world, and Shem Elokim, which is his withholding of that act, are respectively what is known in Kabbalah as Eres and Kelim, lights and vessels. These are two fundamental teachings of the Kabbalah, basic fundamental things you need to understand in the Kabbalah. To answer Eyal's question, there's lots of different types of tzimtzum, but the tzimtzum, to put it very briefly, the tzimtzum withholds the light, and by withholding the light creates the vessels. So you have both. The tzimtzum withholds the light, and by withholding the light creates the vessels, to put it very simply. So it's the tzimtzum is in the light. First there is no vessels. First there is only light. But it's a different type of light. I'm just saying this all without explaining it. It's a different type of light. The tzimtzum creates this dichotomy, more or less, between light and vessel. It's much more complicated than I'm explaining, but that's basically what happens. So the tzimtzum, so therefore you could say that the tzimtzum is really the vessel. But we'll get to all of this more. We'll get into all of this more as we go on. So, vessels and light. The vessel is the main thing here. The vessel is the thing that's hard to understand. The light we can discuss more maybe a different time. What should we think of when we think of vessels? Tonight what we're going to use, there's many metaphors and different ways of thinking about it. We are going to talk about vessels using the famous metaphor which we've mentioned in this class before, from the Pardes, from the Ramak, who talks about water in a glass vessel that is of a color, right? You have a red glass. You have a red glass, and you pour water inside of it. The glass is stained red, and you pour water inside the cup. This is a metaphor for light and vessel. The light is the water. The vessel is the cup. Now, what are we describing when we talk about light and vessel? What are we talking about? Because if we don't separate these things out now, it will become confusing. There's everything that exists, more or less, or I should put more precisely, everything that God has created is created body and soul. This goes all the way up the spiritual levels. When you are talking about actual godliness, the divine emanation, God expressing himself, the body and soul are called vessel, which is the body, and light, which is the soul. And everything that God expresses has these two aspects. There is a light and there is a vessel, and together they make the complete thing. So, for example, a sphira, God's means by which he creates the world, the 10 spheres, right? Kindness, severity, right? As the list goes on, wisdom, understanding, the whole list of the spheres. Each sphera has a light and a vessel. Everything is made of lights and vessels. which is sort of like a soul and a body. Now, here's what we're saying. There's the reason why it's important to understand that there's different things that are made of light and vessels, and it's not all the same, is because the vessels are described, light and vessels described in wildly different relationships. And part of the whole chachma, part of the whole wisdom of understanding Chassidus and Kabbalah is to understand that all of the different metaphors and all of the different relationships between light and vessels are related in one way because it's a prototype. It's an archetype. Light and vessel is an archetype. It's always the same. In one way, it's always the same. Light and vessel. Light and vessel is a description of a fundamental relationship between two things, basically, or two aspects of a thing. But also in many different ways, it's also different in the way that light and vessel expresses. So in a sphera, the vessel exists primarily to express the light. I'm just noting, we're not talking about spheres yet. In a sphera, the vessel exists primarily to express the light. We are talking about something else. We are talking about vessels which exist to conceal the light. We're talking about vessels that are compared to tzimtzum, that are here to conceal the light that is within them. So let's discuss more, and what I mean will become more clear. The Alter Rebbe is fundamentally changing his explanation of the tzimtzum here. The explanation within the brackets at the end of the chapter is different than what we've been saying so far, right? And you can see it in the metaphors. That's what we're going to be discussing basically for the rest of the class. The difference as you can see it in the metaphor. When we had a metaphor before for Havaya and Elokim, which are now what we are calling light and vessel, what was our metaphor? Our metaphor was the sun and its shield. You have the sun makes light, and then there's this choke or shield or sheath on the sun which prevents that light from being expressed. In other words, you really have two separate things that are interacting. You have a light which if left unaffected would continue to be expressed further, and then you put something in front of the light, a screen, a block, and that withholds the expression of the light. Number one, in this metaphor, there's two fundamental things. Number one, the shield on the sun, this choke on the light, or you can use anything, a curtain, this thing which is blocking the light from being expressed. Number one, its effect on the light is only subtractive. It only takes away, right? Putting aside the whole paradoxical nature of the tzimtzum, that it doesn't really take away the light of Havaya as we were explaining before, that's actually what I'm explaining, what we're explaining in a different way. The Kalim add a whole level of depth to that explanation. So put aside that before, the Havaya is not really held back. In the metaphor at least, right? In the metaphor, a curtain in front of the sun, or a shield in front of the sun, my phone died.